You can all be seated. Good morning, everyone. It is such a joy to be able to be with you this morning. And I hope you're full of expectation this morning, because we have a God who is a revival, passionate God, isn't he? And I believe that we are ever closer and closer to a greater outpouring of God's Holy Spirit on this land. And, whenever we come together like this and lift up the Lord's name, it just releases the power of the Spirit going through us and then out into the world. And I look forward to seeing greater and greater outpourings of God's Spirit. You know, I need to perhaps declare my hand right at the beginning here as I come up. And I happen to believe that this book, the Bible, is God's Word, and it's the truth from cover to cover. Now, is anybody with me on that this morning? Well, there's at least two of you. That's fantastic. Look, I have chosen a rather quaint title today, Elephants in the Room. Has anyone heard that expression, there's an elephant in the room? You know, it's an old expression. It means that there's something that has happened or that we all know about, but nobody wants to mention because it's kind of a bit uncomfortable. It's like having a conversation with somebody and there's an elephant in the room, but nobody mentions it. So I want to talk about some different elephants in the room this morning. Now, at our home, my wife is the gardener. And I admire and appreciate the results, but I don't really get to contribute a lot because I really have got no idea. But I do know that when a tree or a plant puts its root down into soil, the nature of the soil influences the fruit that is produced. So who knows that in our culture today, it is increasingly anti-Christian. Have you come across more and more opposition? We're seeing it progressively in the way legislation is enacted, things which are contrary to the Word of God and to Christian values. So it's kind of like there are two trees, if you will. The roots of the trees go down into the soil of belief. And what we believe influences the fruit that we produce. So I want to contrast two different trees today. The first one begins with the assumption that there is no God and that we alone, mankind, determines truth. The other tree says that there is a God, a creator God, and in particular, the God of the Bible. So the first tree means that if there is no God, then we decide what is true. So we are the top of the pile. We determine our own destiny. We determine our future. But in the other tree, it says that God's word must be the truth. So that's going to lead to very different conclusions. On the first tree, if we decide truth, then we have to explain the universe in purely natural terms, and that's where this whole idea of evolution comes from. The idea that over millions and millions of years of unguided random processes, molecules became magnolias and mathematicians and you and me. On the other hand, however, God's word tells us that God is the creator of the universe, that he has it all in his hand. He's seen the end from the beginning. Now, what kind of fruit gets produced from these two trees? Well, in the first one, if it's true that we are just cosmic accidents, then fundamentally we have no purpose at all. We're just bags of chemicals that get to live for a while and then we die and then that's it. That's the end. Pretty miserable, isn't it? But you know, increasingly, more and more people in our culture believe that that must be so, because we've been told by the scientific community that, hey, evolution has been proven by science. But if there's a God and he created us, then he must have made us for a purpose. None of us are actually accidents at all, are we? We are created in the image of God for his purposes and with an eternal destiny. Isn't that a better position to have? I think so. Not only that, but the fruit of the tree on the left says that really life is quite expendable. You know, we just here by accident, so You don't want a child, well, let's just get rid of it before it's born. And people get old and they're not contributing to society, so maybe we should just help them along at the end. So we have abortion and euthanasia. Life is an expendable thing for the tree on the left-hand side. But friends, that is increasingly what we see in our culture, isn't it? But if the God of the Bible is true, life is sacred because we are made in his image. Another of the rather unpleasant fruits is racism. You see, the evolutionary story says that we progressed from the apes through various stages, and finally mankind, particularly white Europeans, appeared at the end of the process. So anyone with darker skin is somehow rather further down the evolutionary scale. That breeds racism. You know, today the media tries to tell us that racism is a product of slavery. But, you know, that's not what drives racism at all. It's actually belief in evolution. But what does the other tree say? It says we're all part of one human family. There was an original set of parents, Adam and Eve, who had many children, all the way down to you and me. So no matter what the colour of our skin, we are members of the one human family. And, of course, we get the latest trend, gender ideology, because we can decide what's true. We get to decide what sex or gender we can be. But God created us right at the beginning, male and female. And there's no doubt of that, is there? What we see in the world around us is exactly consistent with the truth of God's word. So we're in a crazy world, aren't we? I'm old enough to be able to look back at a time when most people went to church, kids went to Sunday school. Nowadays, it's very much the rarity. So it's like this, the two castles diagram, some of you will have seen it. On the left-hand side, we have secular humanism. That's the culture in which we live. And you'll notice that its foundations are evolution. On the right-hand side, we have the church on the foundations of God as creator. Coming out of the secular humanist castle, we see all kinds of social issues. Racism, gender ideology, abortion, family breakups, pornography, the list goes on. It's interesting to look at what's happening in the church today. Now, curiously, some Christians, amazingly enough, are busy trying to destroy the foundations by trying to fit evolution into the Bible. And so maybe God didn't really create, perhaps we are the result of random chance. Some Christians are busily addressing the social issues of the day, and so we should. Some Christians are lining up to take a pot shot at other Christians. That's a bit sad, isn't it? And this guy on the right-hand side, he's just firing off into space. He's got no idea where he's aiming. And the guy at the top, he doesn't even know that there's a battle going on. Friends, we need a solution to the problem. And I think the solution is that the church needs to begin by rebuilding the foundations, getting back to the authority of the Word of God, recognising that it is God who is the creator, that his word is true. We need to attack the foundations of the secular humanist castle, pointing out the flaws and errors in the evolutionary story. And friends, it is riddled with them, and I'll share some of those in a little while. Of course, we should continue to address the social issues of the day. You know, the Bible says that we are to always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have, but to do it with gentleness and respect. So friends, are you prepared to give an answer? Have you got answers to your own questions? Can you answer the questions of the people with whom you're sharing your faith? It's so important, because if we have the answers, then we know that we can stand with confidence on God's word and boldly share the truth. I want to give you an example of how not to give an answer. Some of you may have heard of Dan Brown. He was the author of the Da Vinci Code. It's a great novel. It became a movie, a high action-packed thing. And he was interviewed and said this: I was raised Episcopalian, which is kind of like Anglican in the US, and I was very religious as a kid. Then in 8th or ninth grade, I studied astronomy, cosmology, and the origins of the universe. I remember saying to a minister, I don't get it. I read a book that said there was an explosion known as the Big Bang, but here it says that God created heaven and earth in 7 days, which is right. How would you answer Dan Brown? Are you prepared? Are you able to answer Dan Brown? Please don't do this. Unfortunately, the response I got was, nice boys don't ask that question. A light went off and I said, the Bible doesn't make sense. Science makes much more sense to me. And I just gravitated away from religion. What a tragedy. A minister who was not prepared. Friends, it is so vital that we get prepared. And that's what the Ministry of Creation Ministries International is about, seeking to prepare and equip the church. Well, you're probably aware that way back in the middle 1800s, Charles Darwin came up with his theory, and he proposed that all life originated from some original primordial cell, and through random processes it resulted in all the diverse life forms that we see today. Now, he called it a tree of life, but actually the agency for change in Darwin's tree of life was death. So a better term would be the tree of death. And so here we are, and even up the top, people having a go at each other. Now, Darwin's theory, this idea of this gradual progression, actually depended upon the views that were being promoted in the middle 1800s by Charles Lyell in particular, and that was of the millions and millions of years of geological history. Now, Lyell wrote to a friend, and in his letter he admitted that his objective was to free science from Moses. Now, what does he mean by that? Well, Moses was the author or editor of the first 5 books of the Bible, including, of course, Genesis, with the creation account. So his objective really was to divorce science from the truth. But these guys have different philosophies, right? So what really is science? And it's a good question to ask, because science is limited in what it can do. Now, I had the very great privilege of being involved in the aerospace industry, and I was involved in the design of all of Australia's national satellites. Have you seen those little grey dishes on rooftops pointing up, receiving things like Foxtel, Austar and the pay TV networks and all that stuff? Now, you need to understand that I have absolutely no responsibility at all for what comes over the satellites, all right? You do understand that, I hope. But I had a lot to do with the design of the spacecraft themselves. Now, Australia's national satellite system is owned and operated by Optus. And I know that here today, many of you will have Telstra phones, and I'm happy to pray with you after the meeting, but no, just kidding. But the kind of science that I was involved in is what you could call experimental science. And that's the kind of science which gives us all these amazing technological gadgets like communication satellites and computers and the like. Importantly, experimental science is based on observable, repeatable experiments. But there's another kind of science we hear a lot about. You could call it historical science. Now, in historical science, the scientist looks at evidence in the present, and then he makes up a story about the past to explain what he's observing in the present. So this guy's looking at a fossil in the rock, and he probably believes the evolutionary story because that's what he would have been taught right from childhood. So when he looks at that fossil, he might think to himself, I wonder where in that long, slow progression from the first primordial cell all the way up to complex organisms like you and me, does this little creature fit? And I can imagine him wondering, how many millions of years ago did it live? So can you see that what he already believes about its origins affects how he interprets the evidence? Does that make sense? Yeah. But let's imagine that this guy was a Bible-believing scientist. When he looks at that fossil in the rock, he could think to himself, this fossil was likely laid down by Noah's flood, which would have deposited pretty much the whole of the fossil record all around the world today. Now, friends, that's a radically different interpretation of exactly the same piece of evidence. So we don't actually argue about the evidence, but we interpret it in accordance with what we already believe. So our beliefs, remember, are the roots that go down into the soil and they produce the fruit in our lives. So let's summarise that. Experimental science is about the present, observable and repeatable experiments. Do you know there is never a conflict between science and the scriptures in experimental science? All the conflict arises in this area, in historical science. And why? Because we're talking about a story about origins, one of which begins with the assumption there is no God. And we build an attempt to explain the universe based on that assumption. But the other begins with the assumption there is a God, notably the God of the Bible, and we understand the whole of the world around us through the lens of the Bible's record of history. So science studies repeatable things, but it's history that studies unrepeatable things. So how do we find out the truth about our origins? We can't go back to the beginning to observe them, can we? We need an eyewitness account, just like at the scene of the crime, you know. Someone who was there, someone who loves us, who would not deceive us, who knows everything and who has written down everything we need to know about our origins. And friends, we have that in this book, the Bible. See, the Bible is like a history book of the universe. But it's more than just that, of course, but it is at least that. So when the Bible has passages of history, we can be totally confident that they are true. And what does it tell us? Well, that God created in 6 days, just 6,000 years ago. It tells us that man rebelled against God, and that is what brought suffering and death into what was once a perfect creation. It also tells us that God judged the world with a global catastrophic flood. Fantastic. There we have the history book of the universe. But friends, there's an elephant in the room. And on the elephant is all the evidence that apparently proves the evolutionary story. What do we do with this elephant? You know, over history there have been a number of responses to the elephant. Some people have chosen to just ignore it, pretend that it's not there. Well, I want to suggest to you that that's a very dangerous strategy. And here's the testimony of an evangelist, a man called Charles Templeton, very powerful preacher. He was a colleague of Billy Graham's. In fact, it was said that he was a better preacher than Billy Graham. And the photograph is of Templeton addressing a massive rally. Now, Templeton wanted to know more about theology, so he went along to a theological seminary. I'll get the right words. Sorry about that. And he ended up writing a book called Farewell to God, My Reasons for Rejecting the Christian Faith. What a tragedy. And he said, I believe there is no supreme being with human attributes, no God in the biblical sense, but that all life is the result of timeless evolutionary forces having reached its present transient state over millions of years. What a tragedy. What a tragedy. And this man wrote and said, I went to Bible college thinking Adam and Eve were real people. And I can remember really wrestling with that when my Old Testament professor was pointing out the obvious myths and how they came to be. And I kind of joked at the time that I prayed my way all the way to atheism. Our Bible colleges are destroying the faith of the students. Not all of them, praise God, but some do. Why is that? Because people are trying to integrate the evolutionary story into the Bible. You know, truth is truth. You can't mix it with error. William Provine, who was an atheist, summed it up well. Belief in modern evolution makes atheists of people. One can have a religious view that is compatible with evolution only if the religious view is indistinguishable from atheism. Wow. That's pretty challenging, isn't it? Friends, the elephant is still there. Others have tried to, maybe we can fit all the evidence for evolution into the Bible somehow or other. And there have been all manner of different schemes put forward to do that. And I'm not going to go through all of these today. I don't have time. But when I was growing up, I used to think that, well, maybe God used evolution to create. And you know, a very large proportion of the church today believes just that. They believe that God used evolution. But friends, think about it. Here is Adam and Eve in the garden. God declares it all to be very good. If the millions and millions of years were true, underneath their feet would have been layers of rock with fossils showing death, disease and suffering for millions of years. How could that be very good? And then people say, oh, well, maybe the death that came into the world was human death, and that animals were already dying all around Adam and Eve. Maybe that's how it all fits together. But can you imagine the scene? Here's Adam, and God speaking to him, and surrounding him is all this suffering and death and carnivory and bloodshed. And God says, it's very good. I mean, that's bizarre, isn't it? And others think, well, and by the way, if Adam was already going to die, and maybe he just spiritually died when he rebelled against God, it'd be a bit like this. Here's Adam in the garden, and God speaks to him in the curse, remember, and says, for dust you are, and to dust you shall return. But if Adam was already going to die physically, he would have said, so what? I'm going to die anyway. Friends, the original creation had no physical death in it of any form. It was a perfect, beautiful creation. Our God is a good God. He's a powerful God. He didn't make a mess of the world. We are the ones who have made the mess. So friends, all these different attempts to fit the millions of years into the Bible have one fatal flaw, and that is that they all place death before Adam's sin. And you know what that does? If that's true, that means there is no need for the cross. So when I was a young man growing up, I couldn't understand why Jesus had to die for me. That's a pretty basic question, isn't it, for a young Christian to have? You need to understand, why did the Lord go to the cross for my sins? Friends, he went because the first Adam brought suffering and death into the world. He came to pay the price. So the elephant is still there. I want to suggest to you that a much better strategy is to walk over to this elephant and just give it a good poke. And for instance, let's have a look at this subject of natural selection. You know, the biology books these days tell the students that natural selection is the same as evolution. Well, what is natural selection? You know, if you want to build something complex, you need to have plans, you need information, instructions. And the same is true of making living things. If you want to make this single-celled bacterium here, you would need a large book full of instructions, probably 500 pages of how to fit all the bits together. But if you wanted to make something more complex like a horse, you'd need much more information. Now you need information about making muscles, bones, heart, lungs, etc. Books full of information to make a more complex creature. Now, all of that information is resident in this amazing molecule called the DNA. And it is a staggering molecule. You know, human DNA contains about 3 billion letters, and that is enough to fill over 1,000 books, large books like encyclopedia-sized volumes, full of information. So how does natural selection work? Does it, in fact, provide a mechanism from going from simple organisms to complex organisms by adding information? Well, come with me on a bit of a thought experiment. These two creatures, let's imagine, are dogs. And they have medium-length hair. They have medium-length hair because they have one gene for making short hair and one gene for making long hair. So if they're codominant genes, they will have medium-length hair. Now, from these two, we can get a range of different types of puppies. The first little guy, he inherits the short-haired gene from both of his parents. So he has very short hair. The next two are a bit like their parents. They get a long-haired and a short-haired gene from each of their parents, so they too have medium-length hair. But this little guy, he gets the jackpot. So he gets the long-haired gene from each of his parents, so he is a very hairy little dog. Now let's imagine this population of dogs moves to a cold country with lots of ice and snow and sleet, the climate will select against the short and medium length-haired dogs. And before long, we'll have only the long-haired ones left. And if those two should fall in love and produce a bunch of puppies, guess what? They will all have long hair. But can you see what has actually happened? You see, there's been a loss of genetic information to make short and medium length-haired dogs. But what did evolution need? It needed an increase in information, not a decrease. Natural selection goes the wrong way. It does not support the evolutionary story. In fact, it's not an issue on the elephant in the biblical room. But what about this question of change over time? You know, the biology professor will say, I can see change happening in my laboratory, and what he's thinking about is variation in fruit flies, deformities in wings or something like that. But the way it's presented to you and me through the popular press is that what he's observing proves the molecules to mollusks to mathematicians and magnolias and so on, the evolutionary story. Well, it's true that animals change, right? Dogs do change, but they change into different dogs. And they all greet each other in that doggy kind of way. But they're still dogs. You can't breed one animal to produce another kind. It's the same is true in the vegetable kingdom. You take this mango tree and you take the fruit. From the seed of that fruit, you plant it. What kind of tree will you get? You get another mango tree, don't you? So there is much variation in all the different kinds of organisms that we see in the world, but there is no transition from one kind to another. But friends, that is what evolution needs. You have to go from the primordial cell to all of the diversity of life that we see today. So evolution is not change in living things. It's actually a logical fallacy. It's called equivocation. You change the definition of the word in the middle of the discussion. So friends, change over time is not a problem on the elephant in the biblical room, because the change simply reflects God's foresight in designing creatures that can live in a wide range of environments. But what about mutations? You know, we're told, well, today we observe that mutations happen. Now, they're copying mistakes in the DNA. And if by chance a mutation adds some benefit to an organism, then it might produce more offspring, and maybe that's how we go from simple up to complex. Well, can mutations add information? A quote from Carl Sagan, a very outspoken, high-profile, famous atheist. He died some years ago. I expect he's a creationist now. Anyway, he said, mutations occur at random and are almost uniformly harmful. It is rare that a precision machine is improved by a random change in the instructions for making it. And we all know that intuitively, don't we? If you made random changes in the instructions for assembling a spacecraft, you're not going to get a better product out the factory door. So if I were to take this simple sentence and make a few copying mistakes, mutations, have I added information? Well, of course not. Errors almost always delete or corrupt information, and random copying errors certainly cannot account for the encyclopedic quantities of information in our DNA. Now, here's an example of a mutation, and the instructions for making feathers have been switched off. So this poor little rooster has no feathers. Now, if you're the chook farmer, you'd probably think, well, that's a great idea. Now I don't have to pluck the chooks, right? I think if you're the little chook, though, you'd have a different idea. You're going to get sunburned in summer and very cold in winter. But you see, there is no new information here, just a loss which has brought about the change. By the way, this has a technical name. It's called the TNR mutant, which stands for totally naked rooster. That's actually true, it does. You know, we know from experience that mutations produce things like this deformed strawberry, double-headed snake, useless legs on the back of a calf, and so on. But you can have a beneficial mutation. And for instance, if you're a little beetle living on a windy island and a mutation meant you didn't have wings. You're going to live longer because you won't try and fly and be blown off into the ocean and drown. So his cousins on the mainland all fly, but the little beetle on the windy island does not. But friends, once again, whilst that's beneficial, it is still a loss of information. Now, Richard Dawkins, who is perhaps the greatest champion of evolution and anti-Christian alive today, was once asked this question: Professor Dawkins, can you give an example of a genetic mutation or an evolutionary process which can be seen to increase the information in the genome? Now, this is fundamental to the evolutionary story, so surely there must be stacks of examples. I want to play a short video clip, and it's interesting to see how Professor Dawkins responds to that question. Now, we are kind of having trouble with the sound there, but it's pretty clear he had nothing to say. That silence is very eloquent. He should have had no end of examples to provide. He was asked, has evolution been observed? And his response was, evolution has been observed, it's just that it hasn't been observed while it's happening. Not a very good answer. Professor Paul Davies, who's an Australian scientist, not a Christian, says there is no known law of physics able to create information from nothing. Friends, mutations are not an issue on the elephant in the biblical room. But what about the millions of years? I mean, surely in geology we have irrefutable proof of the vast age of the Earth. And the usual examples are things like Grand Canyon, where you see all these different layers of sedimentary rock. Must have taken millions of years to build them all up, and then the Colorado River comes along and erodes this massive canyon. Obviously it takes millions of years, or does it? If you take a closer look at the layers of rock there, you'll discover that the contact between them is exactly horizontal, goes for hundreds of kilometres. There's supposed to be a 10 million year gap between the Hermit Formation and the Coconino Sandstone. So that means that surface must have been exposed for 10 million years. But surely the next time it rained, there'd be some kind of evidence of erosion. But friends, there is no evidence of erosion for the whole of the exposure of that contact. And that is true of layer after layer after layer. We find all around the world today things like polystrate fossils, where tree trunks run through multiple layers of rock. If those layers took thousands of years to form, the tree trunk would have rotted away long since. And what about stunning formations like this? You can see all those sedimentary layers that have been laid down horizontally originally, and then tectonic movements have buckled the crust and have folded and twisted these things. Has anyone here ever tried to bend a rock? Doesn't work, does it? It shatters. But there's no evidence of shattering at these corners and junctions. So what it says is that they were still water-laden and plastic, and as the waters subsided and the mountains rose up and the valleys sank down, the Bible said, all of those freshly laid layers were changed and formed like that. You know, the Bible gives us an excellent timeline of history, right from Adam through to Noah and Abraham, which is about 2,000 years, from Abraham through to King David, and then via the line of Mary and the line of Joseph to Jesus, about another 2,000 years. So all in all, there's about 4,000 years of elapsed time on that chart. And of course, from the time of Jesus to the present day is about 2,000 years. So that says that here we stand today, about 6,000 years after the creation. 6,000 years. I mean, how can anyone seriously believe that in this day and age? But friends, there is so much evidence. I'm just going to share a couple quickly with you. You know, the river systems around the world dump about 20 billion tonnes of sediment onto the ocean floor every single year. Knowing how much is being added and how much is there, because we can measure it, we can place an upper limit on the age of the ocean. And all of that would have got there in less than 12 million years. But friends, that's a disaster for the evolutionary story, because the oceans are supposed to be at least 3,000 million years old, not just 12. But you might be thinking, yeah, but Mark, that's much too long for the 6,000-year-old age of the earth, according to the Bible. So can anybody think of some mechanism in the past that might have dumped billions of tons of mud and sediment onto the ocean floor? The flood, exactly. I'm glad you got that, otherwise I'd have to start again. No, just kidding. You know, when we look around us today, we find there are about 8 billion people on the planet. Do you know if you start with 6 people, Shem, Ham and Japheth, Noah's 3 sons, and their 3 wives, and let that population grow at the rate of about 0.5% for 4,500 years, you get 8 billion people. You see, the population of the world today is consistent with the Bible's record of history, but it's not consistent with the evolutionary story. So, friends, the millions of years are bereft of evidence. It's not a problem on the elephant in the biblical room at all. As a matter of fact, there is no elephant in the biblical room. Why? Because the Bible is the truth. But there's an enormous elephant in the Darwinian room, not the least of which is there's been nowhere near enough time for evolution to have taken place. And all the proposed mechanisms go the wrong way. They lead to a loss of information, not a gain. And what about the origin of first life? You see, if you believe the evolutionary story, you have to believe that inanimate chemicals somehow or other spontaneously organised themselves into the first living cell. That is a staggering bridge to cross. If you could look at a single cell and enlarge it to be the size of a great city like Perth, and let me just quote this from Michael Denton, who was not a Christian, by the way, when he wrote these words. To grasp the reality of life as it has been revealed by molecular biology, we must magnify a cell 1,000 million times until it is 20 kilometres in diameter and resembles a giant airship large enough to cover a great city like London or New York. What we would see would be an object of unparalleled complexity and adaptive design. We would find ourselves in a world of supreme technology and bewildering complexity. You know, the more biologists can drill into the cell, the more staggering it becomes. There are little machines that zoom about inside every cell to keep it operating, including a little postal service, a little guy called a motor kinesin that marches along the cells carrying sacks of proteins to deliver them to the correct place in the cell where they can do their job. Now, I don't know if this clip will work, but I'll try and run it. If it doesn't, we'll just skip through. Have a look at this. No, we're not getting sound. Any way we can pick the sound up from that? Don't worry, I'll just move on. What that depicted was the most extraordinary little guy. He looks like a little fellow with 2 feet. He walks along little tubules carrying a big sack of proteins that have address labels on them, and he delivers them to the correct place. And there are thousands of them in every single cell, and if they weren't there, you and I would be dead. Professor Paul Davies again. Nobody knows how a mixture of lifeless chemicals spontaneously organised themselves into the first living cell. How did stupid atoms spontaneously write their own software? Any of you who've dealt with computers will know that software is a major challenge to get right, isn't it? And the operation of the machinery in the cell is all driven by stored program control, software. Where did that come from? Professor Sir Fred Hoyle, not a Christian, but an astute scientist, said the probability of the formation of just one of the many proteins on which life depends is comparable to that of the solar system packed full of blind people. Now think about this. The solar system packed full of blind people, randomly shuffling Rubik's cubes and all arriving at the solution at the same time. Can you imagine what that would look like? Friends, no sensible person would believe for a moment that life can come about by chance. In fact, it was in the middle 1800s that Louis Pasteur formulated what we now call the law of biogenesis, that life only originates from life. Now, here's a man called George Wald. He received the Nobel Prize, a very intelligent man, and he said this: "One has only to contemplate the magnitude of this task to concede that the spontaneous generation of a living organism is impossible." Praise God. He looked at the science and he saw the impossibility of it. But then he went on. Yet, here we are as a result, I believe, of spontaneous generation. Did you get that? He just says, it's impossible, but I believe. Can you see the power of our beliefs? Friends, that's why it is so important we base our beliefs on the only source of truth there is, which is the Word of God. I'm reminded of Romans 1:22, professing to be wise, they became fools. This poor elephant is burdened with the challenge of the origin of life. But you know, when we look around, what do we see happening? All life is fading away. Humanity is actually dying primarily because of mutations. We're getting worse and worse with every passing generation. The Bible says all men are like grass, and all their glory is like the flowers of the fields. The grass withers and the flowers fall. But we're not going to become extinct because of this decline in our genes, because we know that Jesus is coming again. He is going to come and he will take us out of this place, and in store for us is an eternal destiny in the new heavens and the new earth. So this process is called genetic entropy. Aging is a genetic process. We are relentlessly running down. Professor John Sanford, who is a world-famous geneticist, now a Bible-believing Christian, says there are at least 100 new mutations per person per generation. Each of us has tens of thousands of bad mutations. 2 to 3% of babies are born with a visible birth defect. 5% of babies are born with a genetic disease. I think that's a conservative number now, actually. Over 6,000 human Mendelian diseases have been identified. That's an inheritable genetic disease. Human geneticists agree that we are degenerating. We're devolving, folks, not evolving. It's getting worse and worse and worse. But Jesus is coming again. So what does genetic entropy show? Well, first of all, Darwinian evolution is falsified. Natural selection can't even preserve our DNA, let alone improve it. And not only that, the Bible timescales are confirmed. Because we could not have existed for millions of years, we would be extinct by now. So this poor elephant has another burden on it. In fact, I think you could replace the lot by saying there is really no evidence for evolution. But how powerful are beliefs? Richard Dawkins again. We don't need evidence. We know it to be true. That, friends, is a blind statement of faith. So Darwin's grand ideas and Lyell's arguments all fade into insignificance because the observed data overwhelmingly supports the account of creation that we find in the book of Genesis. Well, I began by sharing this. We are to always be prepared. Friends, that's why our ministry exists, to equip you with answers to the challenges that we face increasingly in this culture of ours. We have many resources out there on the tables. This one's free, however. This is our website. There's a search window up there. It gives you access to some 13,000 articles. There's a new feature on the front page every single day. We encourage people to get onto that. But it has a very easy web address to remember. Now, if you say something at the same time as seeing it, it helps imprint it into your memory. So I want you to say the web address with me when it comes up onto the screen. So you all ready for that? You ready? Yeah? Okay. So if you want to know anything about creation, you just go to... Couldn't be easier, could it? We also have a free email newsletter service. We call it InfoBites, a fabulous way of staying in touch with the key articles that you'll see on the webpage. Your first email gives you access to a free downloadable DVD. And there are some forms up there. Our team will help you find those. If you give us your postcode, we can tell you if things are going to happen in your area. And I suppose I guess we call it our flagship publication, is the Creation magazine. It comes out 4 times a year. It's written for lay people. You don't have to be a scientist to understand it. And it just gives answers to the challenges that we continually face. My wife and I raised all 4 of our children on Creation magazine, and I know this is by the grace of God, but all of them were committed Christians. You know, if you subscribe today, you'll get a free back issue with every single subscription. If we have your email address, then you can get a digital version. And you know, grandparents, this is a great way to share this God-honouring, faith-building material with your grandchildren. Up to 5 different devices with every single issue. I love this testimony we received. I was converted when someone gave me a Creation magazine. Isn't that phenomenal? Someone just gave them a magazine and now they're in the kingdom. But I love what he did next. Then I subscribed for 5 of my relatives. 4 of them have now come to the Lord. Praise God. Find this form out there. If you take a 3-year subscription, you will get a $15 voucher, which you can use on any of the materials there. A great way of investing that $15 is on the Creation Answers book. Consists of 20 short chapters that address the most asked questions that Christians and non-Christians alike have. Things like, you know, does God really exist? What about carbon dating? We didn't get time to look at that today, but the classic question, where did Cain get his wife? It's a good one. All answered there in the Answers book. You can spend your $15 on a DVD like this one. I recommend this. It's a fantastic recording. Is Creation a Secondary Issue? And this is a new book released just at the beginning of this year. Titans of the Earth, Sea and Air. And we have a wide variety of video clips and video talks and what have you, all there on our website. So let me wrap it up like this. Friends, the evolutionary story places millions and millions of years of death and struggle and suffering before mankind even appears. That means that Adam's rebellion in the garden had no effect. But the Bible says it was Adam's rebellion in the garden, in that perfect world, that led to death and suffering coming into this world. And friends, that's why Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, for as in Adam all die, even so in Christ shall all be made alive. You see, when we share our faith with this lost and dying world, remember that we're talking about, number one, the creator of the universe. He became our perfect, sinless sacrifice. He paid the price that we could not pay. He was the great substitute, the just for the unjust. Friends, he is seated at the right hand of God the Father right now, interceding for each and every one of us. The Bible says he's the bridegroom, seated at that wedding feast to which we have all been invited. So friends, I want to encourage you, if you're a believer here today, get equipped so that you can answer the Dan Browns of this world rather better than his minister did way back then. Perhaps you're not a believer, then I want to encourage you, take that step of faith. It's the best decision you will ever make. Thank you for listening. Let me hand back now to Pastor Dan.
Wasn't that great? So good. You know, it wouldn't be the right thing if I didn't give an opportunity this morning that if you have never made a decision to make Jesus Christ Lord and Saviour of your life, that today is the day to do it. So just across this room, you've heard some great truths this morning. And the truth is that there is a heaven, there is a hell. And the only way to come to an eternity with God is by accepting his Son as Lord and Saviour of your life. So if we can just close our eyes, this is a personal moment across this room. You know, it says in the Bible that if you believe in your heart and you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, then you're saved. So across this room right now, in this moment, I want to put out their invitation. Is it now time to stop going the way that you've been going and give your life to Jesus? And if that's you this morning, can I ask you to be brave? Just put up your hand really quickly. We're going to say a prayer together. Just while no one's looking around. Give the same invitation for those that have maybe walked with Jesus in the past but have fallen away for whatever reason. Now's the day to come back. If that's you, can I just ask you to put your hand up real quick as well? And I'll include you in this prayer. Awesome. That's great. Can we just stand together? Let's just say this prayer together this morning. Dear Lord Jesus, I come before you as a sinner. Thank you for dying on a cross for me and for taking away my sins. This morning I declare that you are my Saviour, that you are my Lord, and I will live for you for the rest of my days. I love you, Jesus. Amen.